headlines.com, the Hook'em Horn Show. Coming back for kind of the part two here. Videos coming this week. Talking about Texas basketball. You know, we're at the point of the offseason that's kind of weird, where it's like the portal's kind of cooling down, but not all the way. We're kind of waiting for NBA draft decisions to play out and, certain players to either, withdraw or stick it through. For Texas now, we've had 5 portal commits. 7 players leave via the portal? 6? I think 6 scholarship players. Maybe I'd have to go back and look at the list. But, the main guys that we've lost to the portal, at least among starters, Tyrese Hunter and Dylan Mitchell. But the 5 guys we've added, I think you can clearly say that we've added more than we've lost if you're just looking at incoming and outgoing with the transfer portal. Obviously, when you consider the guys that we lost to exhausted eligibility, that picture changes a little bit because of how just important guys like Max Asmus, Dylan Dessou were for us last season, averaging, 45% of our total points per game just from those 2 guys in Big 12 play. And so I think that there's a lot of excitement surrounding this team. There's a lot of potential, but there's also still a fair amount of uncertainty about what Texas could be next season because, I just looking at the projected rotation, the backcourt looks pretty solid. I think the wing play, especially on the offensive end of the floor, is going to be better, but you've got questions about the front court. And we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about portal needs, but I want to spend most of this video talking about, what Texas has got from the portal so far. And then again, we'll wrap it up with some of the remaining targets out there. And because Texas is at 11 of those 12 scholarship spots on the roster for next season filled, talk about who that last guy could be, how they could use that final scholarship spot. So I've got the list pulled up here now. We can go from guard to forward here, talking about the 5 portal additions. Just to go up and down the list really quickly. You start at guard. I think one of the top guys that we got this offseason is Oregon State transfer guard. Oregon State transfer guard Jordan Pope, rising junior, guy that led Oregon State in scoring, I believe, each of the last 2 seasons. About clip is 16, 17 points per game. All around, I think he's a guy that really elevates your lineup. Seems like a pretty good locker room guy as well. Someone that can be the primary ball handler, but also just a good scorer, good playmaker. I think he's got the type of size that you would want playing at the 1. Whereas you look at some of the other guards we brought into the mix and that we have coming in from high school, namely Trey Johnson. I think that Jordan Pope is probably your starting point guard next season.
No pushback.
Am I wrong there?
No pushback from me. I completely agree. Like you mentioned, prolific scorer. Averaged 3.4 assists per game last year. I think Pope is going to be that guy that when it's all said and done, there's another guy on top of mine too, but he could lead the Longhorns in scoring next season. He's just kind of that lead alpha guard. He's got experience at the power level, all those things put together, and I'd expect him to have a strong season on the 40 acres. That was a big commitment win coming down between Texas and Texas A&M. That's a massive get. You get a guy who averages 17.6 points per game from the mid-major level, and that guy's a heck of a scorer. But for Jordan Pope to do it, obviously the Pac-12 was a little down last year, but still, for him to do it at a power conference level, very impressive. Complete 3-level scorer. What I love the most, he's 88% from the free throw line last year. You're going to be playing a lot of close games in SEC play. You need experienced guards who can hit their free throws down the stretch. I'm really excited about Pope next season.
And, we talk about losing a guy like Max Asmus, where he was just such a vital scorer for you last year. And, Asmus was giving you double-digit points pretty much every night in Big 12 play. You lose that, you get a guy like Jordan Pope that scored double-digit points in all but 1 game last season. Again, you mentioned Pac-12 a little bit down last year, but you still had some solid tournament squads coming out of the Pac-12. I still think that Oregon State was playing some decent teams there. UCLA, USC was talented. They played Baylor out of conference. Pitt was a decent squad. And So, scoring double-digit points in against all of those teams while still putting up, 3, 4, 5 assists per game. Yeah, I think a really solid get there that fills a big need for you. I think the other like big guard addition for Texas, just in terms of impact, is the Indiana State transfer. One of two guys from that Texas got from Indiana State this offseason, Julian Larry. One of that, what was it? 3 transfer additions that Texas got in the span of a few hours. I think that was on a Sunday in like mid-April. I remember that because it felt like it kept coming over and over and over again. And Texas really got that portal window started out on a hot streak. And, Julian Larry, the reason I hesitated when I was talking about, let me get to that in a second. Julian Larry, he's got a little bit more size. I think more of that combo guard-esque where, he's not as much like a pure scorer as a guy like Jordan Pope or Max Asmus, but, I think he facilitates the offense at a really efficient level, great court vision, handles the ball really well, can play in transition, efficient when he shoots. But I think it was last season was the first time he ever averaged double-digit points per game in his career at Indiana State. You kind of mentioned it. The difference between a guy like Jordan Pope scoring 16, 17 points per game in an efficient manner, may I say, because scoring 16 or 17 points at major conference level is one thing, but when you're shooting 45% from the field, 37% from 3, 88% from the line, that's really efficient volume scoring for you. And, for Larry, I think that he's a guy that you would look to say, okay, if he can go out and get you 8, 10 points per game, 4 or 5 assists, minimizing turnovers, that's a successful kind of 1-2 guard punch that you have. You don't have to have one true point guard necessarily. I mean, I look at what Texas had with a duo like Courtney Ramey and Matt Coleman. While I do think the upside's higher with a duo like Pope and Larry, I think that it sounded, those last names are going to sound so weird together. But
Pope Larry.
Yeah. But I do think that Julian Larry is a really solid, I think underrated get too, because again, Indiana State, solid team last season, really, really good squad in the Missouri Valley Conference. And
yep.
Anytime you can get a guy like Larry, where I think he was averaging like 4.8 assists per game, 2.2 turnovers, somewhere in that ballpark. Whenever you're above that mark of 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio in the college game, that's a really solid mark. And Texas, I think they did a good job managing the basketball in most games last year, but you don't really have any guard experience returning on this team. So having guys that can take care of the basketball, make plays for you like that, give you that stability that you need in the starting backcourt, I think will be huge.
Yeah, and you mentioned the timeline of it. When Julian Larry committed, he was kind of in line to be that starting point guard. And I think, especially in today's day and age of basketball and looking specifically at this Texas roster, it's pretty positionless in the sense that, they're going to Coach Terry's going to mix and match lineups a lot. And he's going to be perfectly fine with playing Pope and Larry in the backcourt together. But also you can take one off the court and not feel like you're losing, a ball. You take one off the court and you don't feel like you're in trouble in regard to a lead guard bringing the ball up. They both can do that. You mentioned Ramey and Coleman. You look 2 years ago with Carr and Hunter. You look last year with Asmus and Hunter. These are guys who are all comfortable playing with the ball in their hands. Terry did a solid job of mixing it up. Who's bringing up the ball? Who's initiating the offense? Things of that nature. Yeah, I think Julian Larry's a wonderful get. He's a guy, played 4 years at Indiana State, 108 starts. He's someone that you look up in the Sweet 16 and you are pumped that guy's on your team. No NCAA tournament experience. Take it up with the selection committee. Indiana State maybe got robbed in March. But Larry's just one of those guys who's comfortable playing in big games. He has all those starts, over 130 college games under his belt, that once you get into SEC play and you get later into March, he's a guy you have a lot of confidence in to make the right decision, make the right pass, and set his teammates up for success.
And I like that you mentioned him playing in some of those big games. I mean, he led the Missouri Valley Conference in minutes played last season. So he also led the conference in assist to turnover ratio, was third in 3-point shooting percentage. I mean, this is a guy that you're saying, fifth-year senior. is going to bring a lot of valuable experience. Is going to. I guess I didn't mention this earlier. I don't know why, because I'm always a sucker for floor spacing. I mean, the fact that you're losing so much of your 3-point shooting from last year's squad. Dylan DeSue, your best 3-point shooter, one of the best 3-point shooters in the Big 12 last season, might I add. Max Asmus, Brock Cunningham, Ithiel Horton. Losing a lot of these guys that were hitting those deep shots for you last year. And Julian Larry, a guy that shot 45.6% from three last season, along with Jordan Pope that's shooting just north of 37%, along with some of the other guys you're getting. Texas, the three ball just was not as big of a piece of the game last year as I think it should have been. Texas had one of the best floor spacing lineups, I think, in the Big 12 at the start of the season. And just whether it was wing inconsistency, just over-reliance on Asmus and DeSue, getting caught up on high ball screens and double teams. I think that Texas has a lot more options this year for scoring the basketball and spacing the floor. So next up here, unless you had anything else you wanted to mention about Larry or Pope. Okay. So among the just ultra high impact guard additions, I guess he kind of fit in that wing bucket too, play the 2 or the 3. Tremont Mark from Arkansas. I know that I think there's a lot of people out there that Mark is kind of their favorite portal addition. I think among the 24/7 Sports composite transfer ratings, among our 5 guys, that he's the highest rated. I would personally say that Pope would be my favorite of the guys we've gotten so far. But, Mark has that SEC experience. After Musselman left it at Arkansas for the USC job, he had a lot of Arkansas guys enter the portal. Also after Calipari was hired from Kentucky. Mark, he's going to give you that sort of playmaking presence, that ability to pull up from really anywhere on the floor, create offense that's just kind of hard to find. And, Texas really got an embarrassment of riches, I think, of these sort of guys that can play at the 2 or the 3 this year. Just because, Larry, Kendall Weaver, I think, is another guy that can kind of play that 3 in a 3-guard lineup. And, Mark is, I think, the tallest of the group. Trey Johnson about 6'5", Tremont Mark about 6'6". So I think Rodney Terry really kind of took it to heart that we needed more lengthy wing scorers, that we were just limited with our backcourt scoring options way too much last year. And so, playing that free-flowing style of basketball, really being able to find any perimeter threat that you would want to be able to create offense, Texas really has all those guys this year. I mean, one of these guys is going to have to come off the bench.
Yeah.
I don't know who it's going to be, but maybe Julian Larry, just because he was a reserve guard 3 years ago at Indiana State, whereas Pope, Mark are, already major conference starters at their last schools. So Mark is a huge get, just because the amount of offense he can create, again, doing it in an efficient way, shooting above 35% from 3 last season. He averaged about 15, 16 points per game in the SEC. So,
yeah, I mean, Mark is clearly the flashy get of this class. True scorer, 3-level scorer, was able to shoot the 3 ball at a 36% clip last year, which is by far the best of his career. Hopefully we can see more of that in Austin this upcoming year. I mean, for me, Mark was a 3-year player at Houston.
3-year at Houston, yeah.
And as a junior, he started every game. If you're good enough to start for Kelvin Sampson, you're 100% good enough to start for Rodney Terry. So I feel confident in Mark's ability. He's got that little bit of that junkyard dog in him. I'm excited to watch him play, how he fits in. I do think it'll be interesting, as we kind of take a broader view of the roster after going through all the additions, where he fits in. I do think you could see him playing a little bit of the 4 this year when Texas goes small. So that'll be interesting to see how he defends against bigger, SEC forwards. But he's going to be a matchup nightmare on the offensive end if that's the case, because he can put it on the deck, get to the rim, had a game winner against A&M last year for Arkansas. So Tremont Mark is a guy that, his scoring might not be at that 16 point per game mark, this upcoming year just because of the offensive options that Texas is going to have. But he certainly will be a double-digit scorer per game. And, he's one of the three guys that could lead this team in scoring, and I would not be surprised.
Yeah, I think that Mark brings you, like you said, a lot of versatility here as well. I think one thing that, we look at a lot of the numbers that these guys are putting up offensively in the type of pretty up-tempo system, free-flowing basketball, pushing the ball in transition that Terry likes to play. But, one thing we haven't talked about a lot is the defensive impact that some of these guys are going to make. Jordan Pope, I think, is kind of that Max Smith style guard where he can give you, I think he'll still give you effort on the defensive end, but at most he'll probably be a net neutral presence there. I think Mark, a guy that was top half player in defensive box plus minus in each of his 3 seasons at Houston. If you're a top half player in box defense, I can't talk right now. You have a top half player in Sampson's system in defensive box efficiency. That is probably a pretty good defender, especially considering Texas ranked in the bottom half of the Big 12 last year in defensive rating. And so I think as far as Mark is concerned, I would have issues probably with him playing too many minutes at the 4, unless you're playing a lot of small ball lineups. Because at that point, you're probably running, Jason Kent at the 5 or Nick Cody or someone like that. And at that point, you're looking at a version of the Houston Rockets in college. But, I mean, who knows? We have a lot of weapons, and I do trust Terry to be able to use a lot of these guys in the right sense, because I still think last year, I don't think that team was ideally what he wanted, even though he said it was. I don't think that was the case. I don't think we are turning over this much of the roster if that were the case. So, next up, and this is probably the least sexy of the 5 portal additions so far this offseason. Malik Presley, sophomore, transfer from Vanderbilt. Guy that played a lot of wing last year when he did play at Vanderbilt, but was more of a developmental player for them. Former 3-star recruit. Really, really bouncy player. I think has a lot of defensive grit, gets to the rim really well, but is hesitant to shoot the 3 ball, doesn't pass it off a ton in terms of playmaking to find his teammates. I see Presley is I think I've seen someone mention this, but this was the initial thought that came to mind for me, was that he's kind of your Anamikwe replacement in a sense, just maybe a little bit more upside as a slasher on the offensive end of the floor, a little bit more length. They can play at the 3.
Yeah. My thoughts on it are, don't look too much into it. Malik Presley didn't play much last year at Vanderbilt. Like you mentioned, he was a 3-star coming out of high school. Can he play at the power conference level in a rotational role? Probably. Will it be next year? No. And you kind of said it with that comparison. Alex Anamikwe didn't really play at all last year. I think we all kind of liked him during his time on the 40 acres, not only as a person, but we had prospects of him, developing out and being a nice, wing that would give you a lot of effort on the defensive end, knock down a couple shots here and there, good slasher, things like that. But all things considered, Presley is going to be in that 10, 11, 12 spot in the rotation, and Terry's going to cut the rotation off quicker than that, especially with all the talent that we have at the guard and wing position going into next season. So I think Presley, you secure a guy like that purely for developmental reasons, just so you're not turning over 8 players every single year, because most of these other transfers that were brought in are 4th and 5th year guys. I think Presley is someone, adds some stability to the program, and hopefully, 2 years down the line, he can be a nice rotation piece.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of look at him like Devin Pryor in a sense too, but the one thing that kind of caught my eye for Presley that I think could be something to watch, I mentioned the slashing ability because you look around at a lot of the other players on this team. They're offensive creators, playmakers, guys that can pull up from really anywhere on the floor, mid-range, deep. A lot of them get to the rim and score too. None of them really as bouncy as Presley, a guy that feels like he just dunk on everyone. I don't think he's got the type of athleticism necessarily that a guy like Dylan Mitchell had or has, but I still think he can be pretty aggressive getting to the rim. Presley, I think, was miscast in his role last season when he was on the floor, like when he was actually getting minutes at Vanderbilt. So he led the team in fast break points per game last season, or led the team in fast break points per 40. Let me rephrase. Um, Vanderbilt was a team that was the second slowest tempo team or second slowest tempo offense in the SEC last season. Um, I think that I think there's something to be said for Presley kind of being that slasher, get out and run, be disruptive, just really that energy guy in every sense of the word. I think there's a lot of data and scouting that backs that up. The last one of the 5 portal additions that Texas has gotten this offseason, and the second Indiana State transfer, Jason Kent. I believe he's also in his last year of eligibility, 5th-year senior. A lot of these guys fit a similar mold. If you look at their like box score stats, where Texas getting a lot of efficient, solid guys on the offensive end of the floor that can put the ball on the floor if need be, can shoot the 3 ball well. Kent, you're getting, I think, a little bit better defense than you would be getting out of a guy like Julian Larry, but I think that this is a solid get because you just need to replace some of the depth that you're losing in the front court.
I completely agree. I mean, so what I'll say about Ken, I like him as a player, and I think he's going to be a solid contributor this season for Texas. I do think a lot of his success last year, you saw a major spike in points per game, and I think that was a lot due to how Josh Schertz, the head coach at Indiana State, used him. Schertz is one of the best offensive minds in college basketball, and listening to some of the NIT broadcasts that Indiana State was a part of, Jason Kent led the country in points per slash, which, that tells you kind of what he is as a player, but that's also a lot that's system based. Schertz is constant movement in the half court from Indiana State, and Kent's good, catch finish type guy, great off ball movement. You're going to need that on a team that has so many ball centric players. You're going to need a guy like Kent to, run the short corners, foul line flashes, things of that nature. I do, however, think that, his totals are going to drop, not a significant amount, but a fair amount. I don't know if he's going to be a double-digit per game scorer next year. I don't know if he's going to get those touches. I also, struggle to see Rodney Terry using him like Schertz did in the half court. That's going to be on Terry because I think Terry knows what he has, but it's kind of up to him to get Kent to play to his maximum potential. All things considered, super high floor player. Started 37 games for Indiana State last year. Like you mentioned, he's going to be a hound on defense. He's a high IQ basketball player. And this is a guy that, again, like I said with the other Indiana State transfer, Julian Larry, he's a guy that when you get into the middle of SEC play and you get to March, these are guys you want on your team because night in and night out, they're going to be pretty consistent with what they're giving you.
He's the only all-defense player that Texas has gotten from the portals so far this offseason. Also the only guy that averages over 8 rebounds, or even over 6. And so he plugs a lot of needs for you. I do agree with you in a sense that I do struggle to see the fit at times offensively, in the sense that, yeah, he was a slasher. He got most of his points in the paint last season, where I think that can still be a thing in a sense of, him. Here's what I don't want for Jason Kent, I guess, is just to put him out on, 80% of your shot clock on your offensive possessions, is for him just to be out in the corner, is your knockdown 3-ball guy, just because you look at him and say, oh, he shot 37% almost from beyond the arc last season playing at the 4, that you can just put him out on an island and be another floor spacer. That's not what he is. He can do that, and he can do that efficiently at times. But yeah, I mean, a guy that scored in the 97th percentile in points in the paint per game. You mentioned that slashing stat. That's interesting. I don't have any synergy data up right now, but that would make sense that, you might try to get some backdoor cuts and things like that to get him open just because of that basketball IQ, that experience playing at the 4. The other thing for me with Kent that I find interesting is, Texas really struggled, obviously, with second chance points and offensive rebounding last year. That was well documented in Big 12 play. I think there was no more decisive indicator for Texas whether they won or lost games than offensive rebounding percentage. And so, you get a guy that averaged over 2 offensive boards per game when you lose Dylan Mitchell, who was such like a vital, like second chance points guy for you last year and really for the last 2 years. Kent helps get you some of those possessions back. Not only that, but he was second among Missouri Valley Conference forwards last year in second chance points per game. So getting in the right spot, helping you win more of those rebounding battles, that's where I think a lot of his value is going to come into play. I'm not saying to park him in the paint. Don't park him beyond the arc. His role is going to have to be a little bit more complex than that. But, he's an experienced guy. I think that on both ends of the floor, he's going to provide you a ton of value. Yeah, I think the other thing to avoid for Kent, and I do want to mention, he's never averaged even an assist per game in any season of his career. I have seen the comparison, albeit not often, but I've seen the comparison on certain message boards to Timmy Allen. And that one for me kind of caught my eye in a sense that I don't necessarily see the connection as much. I can see how you would say like, 6'7" forward, he rebounds the ball well, can score, smart player, good off ball, good cutter, things like that, where you would say, okay, similar to Timmy Allen. But Timmy Allen was a guy that could facilitate the offense from inside the arc. You could give it to him in those dribble handoff sets. You give it to him at the top of the key and say, okay, you go get 2 assists per game, when Tyrese Hunter, when Marcus Carr aren't open or don't have an open lane. Jason Kent isn't that. That was more, I thought that was more of something Dylan Mitchell would be able to do with some of his court vision and some of the like ball handling ability he showed at Montverde Academy. But I digress. I think Kent is a solid get, but again, his role is going to have to be pretty defined because he's not just a cookie cutter type player. Like you said, Schertz really had to find a very specific role for him last year. And you see that with the way that his stats ballooned and in an efficient manner too. So, okay. Do you have anything else you would add about the 5 portal editions so far?
No, I think we touched on.
So last thing I wanted to say, or last thing I wanted to cover was, this final roster spot. I feel like a lot of off seasons when you're talking about filling the final roster spot, it's just like, okay, let's get a good depth piece in here, round out the roster, put the finishing touches on the core part of the rotation before you get into summer workouts. And you get all your guys on campus. That's not the case here. I think this is a really integral part of the front court that Texas needs to fill with this final scholarship spot. Texas targeted Brandon Garrison as kind of one of the priority guys early in this portal cycle this spring. Ended up missing out on him. Kind of a weird portal recruitment where, things were going back and forth. Looked like he was trending Oklahoma at one point, and Oklahoma State got back involved, and then he took the visit to Texas. Texas was looking good for a little bit, then Arkansas was threatening, and then he commits to Kentucky seemingly out of nowhere before even taking a visit there. When it just seemed weird because it seemed like being close to home was such a huge factor for him in that portal recruitment. But, he ends up going further away than any of the other schools he was considering geographically. So, without talking too much about Brandon Garrison than I already have, there were a few other guys that Texas was looking at. Rydas Petratus from Air Force, a guy that was a quality scoring forward that Texas really wanted, ended up committing to Cal over Texas. I got to wonder a little bit there how much Texas was actually pushing for him, or if, kind of like we were talking about Caden Shedrick last year, just that, maybe at one point it looked like he would be able to fill a starting spot. Texas ends up getting Jason Kent, and it's like, okay, maybe you won't be starting at the 4 anymore. That was a weird one. I say that if Texas uses this scholarship spot on anyone that isn't a quality low post player on both ends of the floor that can add some solid front court depth, that's a bit of a failure strategically with your portal aim.
Yeah, 100%. You have to round out the roster with a bruiser down low, a guy who is solid on the defensive end of the floor, can rebound the basketball, and can score off the low block. I think there are a couple names that we'll get to that fit that role. Because looking at the roster right now, I think you could argue that your five best players are all 6'6" and under. We touched on Jordan Pope, Julian Larry, Tremont Mark, and then I'd throw true freshman Trey Johnson and Kendall Weaver in there too. I think you could have some discourse with Weaver and some of these other guys, but I think those might be your best five players. So you do really need help in the front court. We know Caden Shedrick, has had the injury history. Zarek Onyema, who, once Dessou and Shedrick were healthy, Onyema didn't have a spot in the rotation. So that's kind of where the staff sees him. Obviously, there's going to be some progression this offseason, but there's a lack of talent and depth in the front court, and that needs to be addressed in a big way if you really want to create a team that could play deep into March.
I completely agree. I mean, the front court right now, you've got Caden Shedrick, who, if Shedrick had multiple years of starting experience with like limited injury history, that's one thing. But, we're talking about a guy that had consistent back issues last year, that had to miss a few games and limited minutes for certain stretches. And then you got Devin Pryor, who isn't ready yet by all accounts. I think a guy, again, that has solid upside, but even so, I think he's more of a three or like a swing forward guy. You're not looking him play minutes at the five. And then Nick Cody, true freshman that, again, high upside. I will say, I think there's a lot of talent in the front court from the guys we have. It's the proven experience or lack thereof and the injuries with Shedrick that really makes you question the front court depth, because the only guy that you have coming in that played a full season last year as a starter that's a front court player is Jason Kent. No one else. So, I think I've said enough about the lack of depth in the front court, because it's been well documented this offseason that's where Texas is looking, that's where they need to go, and that's who they're targeting right now in the portal. I did a piece on the site the other day talking about how I think Texas could use that final scholarship spot, which, and it's pretty much all forwards, all big men that Texas should and could be going after. The one name that I'm going to start with that I think is the top guy, I mentioned him as the top priority for Texas in the portal right now, is JT Toppin, the New Mexico transfer. Mountain West newcomer of the year, guy that was one of the best players on, I would probably say, the best New Mexico team of the last 5-6 years at least. I think this year was the first year that New Mexico, a good traditional basketball program, by the way, had made the tournament since like the mid 2010s. And so almost a decade that it had been with their tournament drought. He averaged, about 12 points per game, 13 points per game, somewhere in that mark, and then about 9 rebounds. Led the Mountain West in offensive rebounding percentage, total offensive rebounds. He's just, you mentioned the word junkyard dog. He is the guy that's going to live on the glass, that can score for you in the low post, get some really big buckets too, in the sense that, lengthwise, he's not the biggest like power forward or big man that you'll find out there, but he's still got good length, about 6'9", 210, 220 pounds. But he's a guy that's going to finish for you when you dump the ball down low on some of those key possessions. I think he led the Mountain West in field goal percentage last year. And so right now, I think he's where your focus has to be. Texas right now is one of 4 schools that he's mentioned that are kind of his top 4, at least early in the portal recruitment. The other 3 being Texas Tech, Kansas State, and Alabama. He did declare for the NBA draft, so he's going through that scouting process right now. This is a portal recruitment that's going to be long and dragged out. If you're a Texas hoops fan, one of those, you say buckle up. There's going to be maybe some twists and turns, but it's going to have to be a patient process from the Texas perspective.
Completely agree that JT Toppin should be the number 1 target. Watched a lot of Mountain West hoops last year. And, at first it was like, who is this freshman? Like he's dominating on both ends of the floor. And then game after game, like it wasn't just a flash in the pan. He was one of New Mexico's, best players last year. just he's so active on the defensive end of the floor, and that's really what Texas needs. Like you said, he's not overly big. He's not just going to like crush you with his size. It's with his activity, with his hand movement, averaged nearly 2 blocks a game last year. I mean, he's a perfect piece, and he's a really high level college basketball player. I do expect that, after he goes through the process, he will return to school because the longer this goes, he's one of the most coveted prospects currently still left in the portal. So, he has that on his side and can use that to his advantage in regard to NIL. But yeah, JT Toppin will be the perfect piece to kind of close out this current team. I think he adds an element that not a lot of the other, portal guys have added in regard to the defensive tenacity and, his willingness to be that guy who's kind of the heart and soul of your team and your defense.
I'm looking up a stat right now. I'd seen something the other day on him that was just really impressive. Yeah, he's one of two Mountain West true freshmen um to ever average over a block and a half per game and over 9 rebounds. The only other one being Cam Oliver, who was, I think, like a 2 or 3 time All Mountain West player at Nevada. And so, you know, yeah, Toppin is the guy that you want to get. I think the question with Toppin is, obviously he would probably be your starting five if you got him. I think the tough part there is, for a second straight off season, do you tell Caden Shedrick, okay, you're starting the season coming off the bench, basically? That's the question there. But I mean, if you have a chance to get a guy like Toppin, and Texas does, obviously, because they're in his top four right now, then you have to make him a priority. You have to go all out. Really throw the kitchen sink at him. A few other guys that I think Texas has their eye on, among kind of big men in the portal. One, I would have to look up pronunciation on this. Big man from Utah. I think is it Kebakita? Kibakita? One of
I'm not
those.
sure. Yeah, sounds good to me.
I know how to pronounce the last name. That's the only one I've heard, though. I only watched a handful of Utah games last season, and while he was an important part of their team, he wasn't as integral as, say, top into New Mexico or someone like that, obviously. But Kita, he's someone that has connections to Texas. Texas recruited him out of high school. I don't remember if they actually offered him, but I know that Texas, if they did, never really made a big push. He has relationships there, though, because he was part of the 2022 class. And so Terry was still on staff at the time at Texas. Granted, he was a new coach on staff at the time in the sense that, that was the first year of Chris Beard's staff at the school. And so I do think that, there are ways that Kita fits at Texas that you like more natural in a sense. That's a more natural sell for everyone involved than JT Toppin. I'm not saying that I want Kita on the priority scale right now higher up than Toppin. I just don't think that's the case. But Kita guy that had I think top 10 among Pac-12 big men last year in player efficiency rating. He's good on both ends of the floor. He's about 6'7", 230, so he's a big body for his height. He did play a lot of minutes at the 5 last season. And so as far as his height and his length is concerned, he is a smaller player to play at the 5, but he's a good rim protector. He's a good defender. He's a good rebounder. He's a decent low post scorer too. In ways, I think he's a better version of what you get in Zarek Onyema, because I think Onyema, when we looked at the tape last year and looked at the stats, you saw a guy that, looked like a pretty ferocious rebounder and a decent back to the basket scorer. And we were just hoping, he's someone that was recruited to UTEP by Rodney Terry. If he gets back in Terry's system, maybe he can develop. We just didn't really see that with Onyema last year. He didn't get that many minutes off the bench. The ones he did were underwhelming at times. In terms of real plus minus last season at Texas, he was second from the bottom on guys that were playing over 8 minutes per game. I think you got to get a guy, if Texas doesn't get JT Toppin, they got to get a guy like Kita that can still give you 15, 20 minutes a night of quality minutes in the front court off the bench.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like we mentioned, I want to stress the importance of that JT Toppin. is the number one guy, and he's the guy left in the portal that could come in and be a massive contributor. And if you swing and miss on him, a guy like Kita, like you mentioned, he's a 15 to 18 minute per game type guy, and he just adds size to the front court. And that's really what you're getting in Kita. You're not getting a guy who you can, dump the ball down into. More just a big body out there who's played and started power conference games, can rebound the basketball, like you mentioned, well, but it's not a true difference maker.
Yeah, I agree. And would you agree with this sentiment here that, obviously, again, top and number one right now among portal priorities? And I got to say, too, with the other schools involved, yes, Texas Tech, Kansas State, and Alabama are all respectable basketball programs. I guess I might be a little bit scared that Alabama and Nate Oates, they can recruit pretty well, especially with how they finished their season on a high note with a deep NCAA tournament run. This is a portal recruitment that theoretically you should be able to win. Like, NIL wise, need the ability. I mean, because like I said, if JT Toppin comes in, I just don't see a world where he's not starting at the 5 right away. And you got to look. I don't think that. Correct me if I'm wrong here too. Maybe Alabama. I don't think that any of those teams though have a better starting 5 than Texas with Toppin in the mix.
Oh no, I don't think so. I think yeah.
And he's from, I think he's from South Dallas.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he's from Oak Cliff. And shout out, because that's pretty much where I am now, or that's pretty much where I am now. So use that as a selling pitch. Just, few hours up I-35, Texas among his finalist schools is the closest to home. I think technically from looking at his high school profile that he's from Waxahachie, and so even a little bit closer to Austin than South Dallas by 30 minutes. And so, Toppin, I don't want to get myself too deep into that conversation because there's a long way to go for that portal recruitment. Here's the point I'm trying to make is that I think Kita is the baseline, what you need. Like he is the guy, that type of player that's, again, solid 15 to 20 minutes, as we've been saying, off the bench per game sort of guy. Like a Christian Bishop type, kind of. In a way, I think that you're hoping for a little bit more in terms of two-way productivity than what Bishop gave you a couple years ago. But I digress. I think that Kita is the baseline, that sort of guy that will give you solid two-way production. But like you're saying, there's only a handful of guys in the portal right now that are going to give you that sort of like difference maker impact, that sort of next level impact in the front court. JT Toppin's one of them. I think that Coleman Hawkins, I mentioned him as just like a wish list player because I think so the thing with Coleman Hawkins, he's a 4-year player at Illinois. He did, interestingly enough, announce his intention he announced that he's declaring for the NBA draft while entering the transfer portal. He said, in his tweet announcing it to the Illini fan base that, calm down. I plan to follow through with the NBA draft thing. But if you plan to do that, why not just announce that you're declaring for the NBA draft? If not, you're returning to school.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine to some degree he's talking with someone else out there, or he's at least keeping his options open. But, he's the type of guy, multi-year starter from the Big Ten that you would love to get, has the type of size that you're looking for. 3rd team, I believe, all Big Ten performer. And then Trevon Brazile from Arkansas, I think would be another. I think he would be a really interesting one. I don't know how much he's really looking at Texas right now, because I think that's one you would have to move pretty quick on if Texas was going to be able to get him. But, you already got Mark from Arkansas. Brazile could come in and, if he doesn't start, give you starter level minutes at least. So, but though, like we're saying, there's not a ton of guys like that left in the portal, and there's not going to be, because at this point, all they can enter are grad transfers. You got summer semester starting here in just a few weeks, and so guys are going to want to get enrolled, find their destination. So, any other guys that you would want to mention?
No, I think we hit on them all. I think it's pretty solid. I mean, it's getting, like you mentioned, it's getting down to it. So you miss on JT Toppin, it starts to get a little bleak.
Yes. Where I don't want to see Texas go with this is another developmental guy. I know that one of the names that's been thrown around is I'm gonna butcher the hell out of this name. The guy from Turkey, the UCLA transfer, excuse me.
Mm.
Uh Burke Burke by Townsell. I don't know. I don't know. I would have to get a pronunciation for that last name. But he's from Turkey. I know that I'm losing dog is Balbe, right?
Yeah.
That's an assistant or that's a staffer it's a staffer under Rodney Terry. And I believe he is a Turkish native as well. And so you have that connection there. I don't know if Texas recruited him um, before he ended up at UCLA. But I think that Burke has a decent upside. Again, we can't take on another developmental guy at this point. You've already got what, three of them between Pryor, Presley, and Nick Cody, and so you need a guy that's going to be making an impact. Anyway, um, I always say let's do a prediction when we're getting out of here. As it stands now, where would you realistically put Texas in like a preseason AP poll scenario?
Yeah, it's tough to say because all the rosters are in flux. So it's one of those things where you go through a preseason ranking and you're like, oh, I forgot that he went here. I mean, it's just so even you look at like the Kansases of the world, they're basically flipping their whole starting lineup. You got Hunter Dickinson and KJ Adams back, but I think this Texas team. I will say this: I do think in a lot of the preseason polls they will be underrated because I think these, rankers or whatever you want to call them, journalists that create these polls are starting to value more continuity, especially when filling out their preseason poll, because, you go ahead and put a team like this in the top 5 or top 10 and, they don't gel well together, then you don't look so smart midway through the season. But I think talent considered, this team is definitely more talented than last year's team. And I would expect they start the year without JT Toppin, in that 15 to 17 range. And if you get JT Toppin, you start creeping up towards the top 10, potentially as a single digit ranked team to open the season. So I think a lot to be excited about for sure. It's going to be really fun to watch them in November and December in the non-con. Watch all these guys gel together. I mean, right now with the 5 transfers you're bringing in, that's 60 points per game last season. And you talk about adding Trey Johnson as well. And you got guys like Kendall Weaver and Shedrick who were contributors and rotation players last year. There's a lot of firepower on this Texas roster.
Agreed. I would say as it stands now that I would probably rank Texas 15th. I at this point feel like it's like a coin flip if Texas lands JT Toppin. Just because you had that proximity to home, you have that selling point of fit in the lineup. I guess earlier I was saying that Texas probably has the best starting 5 if you have Toppin, and that is potentially true among his his top 4 schools right now, but Alabama is pretty good. And so yeah, but I would with Toppin, I mean you're top 10 at that point. I would say in the scope of the SEC that Texas with or without Toppin is probably a top 10 or top 5 preseason team in the SEC right now. I just don't think that outside of the Alabama schools that you have a lot of depth, like top end depth in the SEC, at least compared to the Big 12. That might not be fair because the Big 12 is probably going to be the best basketball conference in America again next season. But I do think that, you're in danger of, if you don't fill that last spot in the front court unit, that you have a danger of falling behind some of the other teams in the SEC, like a Tennessee, like a Florida, even like a Texas A&M or Arkansas. And so this last portal recruitment, whoever Texas is able to land is going to be a big one. Decisive.
Yeah, certainly.
So anything else you would add just for basketball as a whole? I think we got it.
Yeah, no, I think we got it covered. I think this is what happens every single year. But with Rodney Terry, the 2 off seasons he's had, there's always mass panic at the beginning of the off season, and then you give him some time to Yeah, the staff is a solid recruiting staff. You can say what you want about what they do November through March, but they can recruit well. You're recruiting to Austin, University of Texas. You got KD on the wall everywhere. A lot of good selling points, and once again, you're gonna have a very talented team when the season opens up in November.
Agreed. And we haven't mentioned. I know Trey Johnson's going to be like the most hyped up player that everyone wants to see because he's probably the best recruiter you've gotten probably since Dylan Mitchell. And so, but he's just the best scoring guard that you've gotten from the high school ranks in a while. Yeah. And so it'll be a fun team to watch on the offensive end for sure. We just need the front court to come together, and I think it's going to be a really solid team. All right. Well, we are running up on 2 hours now, so got a lot of good content for y'all. Stay tuned because as basketball winds down for this, whatever this last portal recruitment is, we'll have more like complete lineup looks for y'all and projections there. And yeah, coming up on the start of official visits and stuff like that for football, the never-ending cycle that is football coverage for Texas. So anyway, for Shane Black, Andrew Miller, Hook'emHeadlines.com, the Hook'em Horn Show. That's pretty much it. Welcome.